The gun was already cocked when Rebecca Fairchild pressed it against Hugh Slater's broad chest, her hand trembling not from fear, but from the kind of fury that burns so hot it turns cold at the center. The evening sky behind the Slater ranch bled orange and violet, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain, but Rebecca could not appreciate any of it. She could only stare into the dark eyes of the man who had just told her, in a voice scraped raw with something that sounded dangerously close to grief, that he would not marry her, that he could not, that she deserved better than the wreckage he carried inside his chest. "Say it again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but cutting through the air between them like a blade. "Say you do not deserve a second chance. I want to hear it one more time before I decide whether I believe you or whether you are the biggest coward I have ever had the misfortune to meet." Hugh did not flinch from the pistol. He had faced worse things in his life, and the sad truth of that was written in every scar on his hands, every line carved too deeply into a face that should have belonged to a younger man. He was 32 years old and looked like he had been weathered by something far more brutal than the Wyoming sun. He looked like a man who had made peace with dying and had not yet made peace with living. "Rebecca," he said, and just the sound of her name in his mouth broke something inside her even as it enraged her. "Do not Rebecca me," she snapped. "You brought me here. You sent for me. You wrote me letters that made me believe there was a future waiting for me in this God-forsaken territory, and now you stand there looking at me like I am a problem you cannot solve and tell me you do not deserve a second chance." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated herself for it. She had promised herself on the 3-day stage journey from Kansas City that she would not cry, not for any man, not ever again. "Well, I say I will be the judge of that, not you." The gun wavered. Hugh reached up slowly, the way a man reaches toward a spooked horse, and wrapped his large, rough hand around the barrel. He did not push it away. He simply held it, his palm against the cold steel, and looked at her with those impossible dark eyes. "Then God help you," he said quietly, "because the truth is going to be worse than you think." And that was how it ended and began at the same time, standing in the fading light outside a ranch house that held more secrets than furniture, between a woman who had come west with nothing left to lose and a man who believed he had already lost everything that mattered. But to understand any of it, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the day Rebecca Fairchild stepped off the Cheyenne and Black Hills stagecoach in the small Wyoming territory town of Harrow Creek, with a carpetbag in each hand and a letter folded inside her bodice that had kept her company across 3 states. The year was 1882, and the West was not the wild, romantic thing that newspapers back east made it out to be. It was hard and hot and indifferent to the ambitions of individuals, and the town of Harrow Creek reflected that truth without apology. The main street was packed dirt, rutted by wagon wheels and baked to the consistency of brick in summer. There was a general store, a barber shop, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a church that leaned slightly to the left as though it had given up on standing straight, and a small telegraph office that represented the thin thread connecting this place to the civilized world. Rebecca stood on the plank sidewalk and looked at all of it and felt, for the first time in months, something that was not quite hope but was close enough to it to be dangerous. She was 26 years old. She had grown up in Kansas City, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother, both of whom had died within a year of each other when she was 23, leaving her with a small house, a smaller inheritance, and a very large problem in the form of a man named Arthur Crenshaw, who had been her intended, and had turned out to be the kind of man who considered a woman's grief a convenient distraction from noticing that he was slowly and methodically stealing everything she owned. By the time Rebecca understood what Arthur had done, the house was gone, the inheritance was gone, and Arthur himself was gone, having relocated to St. Louis with a widow of considerably larger means. What he had left behind was the kind of humiliation that does not fade, and a Rebecca Fairchild who had quietly and methodically rebuilt herself from the inside out, starting with the decision that she would never again wait for a man to offer her a life. She would build her own. She had been working as a school teacher when she answered the advertisement in the Kansas City Journal. It had been placed by a Hugh Slater of Harrow Creek, Wyoming Territory, who was seeking a woman of education and good character to assist in the management of his ranch and household, with the understanding that matrimony was a possible outcome if both parties found themselves agreeable. The advertisement had been careful, precise, and oddly honest. It had said, "I am not an easy man to know. I will not pretend otherwise. But I need a capable partner, and I believe in being direct about what I require and what I can offer." Rebecca had found that honesty more attractive than any flowery poetry. She had written back. The letters they exchanged over the following 2 months were unlike anything she had expected. Hugh Slater wrote with the same directness he advertised, but underneath that directness there was a quality she could only describe as wounded earnestness. He described the ranch with precision and without exaggeration. He described his daily routine with the thoroughness of a man who found comfort in order. He asked her questions about herself that were genuinely curious, not performative, and he remembered her answers in subsequent letters and built on them. He told her he had been married before briefly, and that his wife had died, and he offered nothing more than that, and Rebecca had respected the boundary even as she wondered about the story behind it. What the letters had not prepared her for was Hugh Slater in person. He was waiting for her at the stage stop, which was not the stage office, but rather a wide spot in the road where the coach paused to exchange horses, just at the edge of town. He stood beside a bay horse with a white star on its forehead, wearing a battered hat and a shirt that had been ironed, she could tell, with considerable and probably unaccustomed effort. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same rock that made up the Wyoming landscape. He was also, unmistakably, carrying the weight of something enormous. It was in the set of his shoulders, the careful stillness of his face, the way he looked at her when she descended from the coach as though he was already bracing for a disappointment he had not yet identified. "Miss Fairchild," he said, and removed his hat. "Mr. Slater," she replied and extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm, his hand rough, and he released her quickly as though contact was something he rationed. "How was the journey?" asked. "Long," she said honestly, "and very dusty, but I am here." Something moved in his expression at the simple declaration of her arrival as a fact, as a thing she had chosen. "You are," he said, as though he needed to confirm it. "I will take your bags." She handed them over and followed him to a buckboard wagon she had not noticed parked behind the horse, and they drove out of Harrow Creek toward the Slater Ranch in a silence that was not entirely comfortable but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two strangers trying to take an honest measure of each other. The Slater Ranch was called the Double S, and it sat on a broad, rolling section of the Wyoming plain backed by a ridge of low mountains that turned purple in the afternoon light. It was not a grand operation, but it was a serious one. She could see that immediately. The fences were in good repair. The outbuildings were maintained. The horses in the pasture were good quality, and there were enough of them to tell her the ranch was productive. The main house was smaller than she had imagined, a 2-story structure of logs and rough-cut lumber that had been added onto at least twice, which gave it an appealingly organic quality, like something that had grown rather than been built. A man came out of the barn as they pulled up. He was older, perhaps 60, with a weathered brown face and sharp eyes, and he took the horses without being asked. "This is Deke Holly's," Hugh said. "He manages the horses and has worked this ranch longer than I have owned it." "Miss Fairchild," Deke said, and nodded with a respect that was genuine and not performed. "Mr. Holly's," she replied, and she could see in his expression something that might have been cautious relief, as though he had been waiting to see what kind of woman arrived. The inside of the house was clean, which surprised her, because she had half expected the chaos of a man living alone. The furniture was sparse but solid. There was a parlor with a good stone fireplace, a kitchen that was functional rather than comfortable, a dining room, and a study that was clearly the room where Hugh Slater actually lived, given the state of the desk and the number of books piled against the wall in stacks of precarious logic. She had noticed the books immediately and felt something warm shift in her chest. "There are 2 bedrooms upstairs," Hugh said, carrying her bags to the foot of the stairs with a careful formality. "You will have the one on the right. It has the better view." "Thank you," she said. "Mrs. Alcott from town comes twice a week to help with the house," he continued. "There is also a cook, a man named Pete, who does the midday meal for the hands and will do evening meals for the house if required. I generally do not require it. I tend to eat simply." "I can cook," Rebecca said. "I am not helpless in a kitchen." He looked at her then directly in a way that was already becoming familiar. "I did not think you were," he said. They were careful with each other for the first week. Scrupulously polite, scrupulously proper, operating in the same house with the careful orbits of 2 planets that had not yet determined whether they were attracted to each other or on a collision course. Rebecca spent her mornings learning the rhythms of the ranch, asking deep questions about the horses and the land and the operation in general, because she believed that understanding the actual business of a place was the only way to be genuinely useful rather than decoratively present. She spent her afternoons in Hugh's study with his permission, reading, because the man had an extraordinary collection of books for a Wyoming rancher, and she wanted to understand what kind of mind lived behind those careful dark eyes. She found, on the second day, a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman with a handwritten inscription on the inside cover. The handwriting was different from Hugh's, lighter and more fluid. It said, "To H, who contains multitudes even when he refuses to admit it, with love always." See, she closed the book and put it back. On the 4th day, she found him standing at the pasture fence in the early morning, watching his horses move in the pale gold light, and she came to stand beside him because it seemed the natural thing to do, and they watched the horses together in silence for a long time. "The chestnut mare is going to foal soon," she said, because she had noticed the mare's heaviness the day before. He glanced at her sidelong. "Day after tomorrow, I think," he said. "You know horses." "My father had a friend who bred them. I spent a great deal of time in his barn as a child." She paused. "I am not entirely a city woman regardless of how I arrived." "I did not think you were," he said again, and this time there was something almost like warmth in it. They settled into a routine over the following days that felt, to Rebecca's quietly astonished heart, suspiciously like happiness. She helped with the ledgers, which were meticulous but had a systematic flaw in how livestock depreciation was being tracked, and when she pointed this out to Hugh, he stared at her for a moment and then pulled up a chair and spent 2 hours going through the books with her. And it was during those 2 hours, sitting side by side over columns of figures with their heads bent close, that she first became aware of him as a physical presence in a way that was something beyond polite appreciation. He smelled of soap and horses and the particular clean dryness of Wyoming air, and when his hand moved across the ledger page to point something out, the knuckles were scarred in a way that told a story she could not yet read. They had dinner together most evenings, and it was during those dinners that the conversation gradually deepened from practical exchange into something more personal. Hugh Slater was not a man who talked easily about himself, but he was a man who listened with extraordinary attention, and he had the rare quality of making Rebecca feel, when she spoke, that everything she said was worth hearing. She told him about her parents, about teaching school, about the careful way she had rebuilt her life after the Arthur Crenshaw disaster, not using those words but the outline of the story, which was enough. He did not offer sympathy, which she appreciated. He offered instead a considered response. "You are considerably more resilient than you give yourself credit for, I think." "I am exactly as resilient as the situation required," she said. "There is no particular virtue in surviving when the alternative is worse." He smiled at that briefly, and it transformed his face into something she had not been prepared for. The smile reached his eyes and made him look, for just a moment, like the man he might have been before whatever had weighed him down had settled on him. She was falling for him. She knew it the way you know a change in weather. Not all at once, but in the gradual accumulation of signs. The way her pulse quickened when she heard his boots on the porch steps in the evening. The way she found herself choosing books from his shelves and reading passages she wanted to discuss with him specifically. The way she lay awake at night in the room with the better view, and listened to the silence of the house, and thought about him moving around in the room next door. It was at the end of the second week that the first crack appeared. She had gone to the general store in Harrow Creek with Deke to pick up supplies, and while Deke was loading the wagon, she had gone into the store to settle the account, and the woman behind the counter, a stout woman named Mrs. Garfield who managed the store with her husband, had looked at her with an expression of such complicated sympathy that Rebecca had felt the first prickle of unease. "You are the woman staying out at the Slater place," Mrs. Garfield said, not quite a question. "I am," Rebecca said. "Rebecca Fairchild. I hope it suits you, Mrs. Garfield said, and the care with which she chose those words was notable. "Hugh Slater is a good rancher." "He seems to be," Rebecca agreed. There was a pause that was just slightly too long. "He has had a difficult few years," Mrs. Garfield said. "Some men carry their troubles quiet and some carry them loud, and he is the quiet kind, which is its own challenge." Rebecca took the receipt Mrs. Garfield offered and looked at the woman steadily. "Is there something you think I should know?" she asked, because she had never seen the use in dancing around a thing. Mrs. Garfield's expression flickered. "That is not my story to tell," she said, and the kindness in her voice made the words worse rather than better. Rebecca drove back to the ranch with Deke in a thoughtful silence. Deke, who was not a man who talked unnecessarily, glanced at her twice but said nothing until they were nearly to the gate. "Whatever you heard or did not hear in town," he said then, staring straight ahead at the road, "I would ask you to go to Hugh directly if you have questions." "I intend to," Rebecca said. But she did not right away, because something in her understood that the timing mattered. Hugh had walls built with the careful precision of someone who had learned through painful experience that most people given access to those walls would damage what they found inside. She did not want to storm them. She wanted to find the door. She found a different kind of entrance 3 days later, in the form of a small wooden box on the shelf above the fireplace in the parlor, which she had noticed before but not paid attention to. It was on an afternoon when a thunderstorm had driven everyone inside, and the light was gray and close, and she was alone in the parlor reading, and she happened to look up at the shelf and see the box, and beside it a small framed photograph that she had not noticed before because it had been half hidden behind a lamp. She crossed the room and looked at the photograph without touching it. It showed a young couple. The man was Hugh, visibly younger, with the same dark eyes and the same strong jaw but with the weight removed, or not yet added, and he was smiling in a way she had seen only glimpses of in the past 2 weeks. The woman beside him was small and pretty, with fair hair and a smile that suggested someone who had not yet encountered anything that could stop her. And then Rebecca looked at the woman more carefully, and she felt the world shift in a way that had nothing to do with the thunder rolling across the Wyoming plain outside. She went to Hugh that evening after dinner, while he was in his study working through correspondence, and she sat down across from him without being invited and said, "Tell me about your wife." He had gone very still. He did not look up from the papers immediately, and she could see the minute adjustments happening in his face, the careful arrangement of expression. Then he looked up. "Her name was Clara," he said, "the C of the inscription in the Whitman book. She had known on some level. She died," Rebecca said. "Yes." A pause that contained something large and complicated. 3 years ago. "How?" Rebecca asked because she needed to, because not knowing was a dark corner that her imagination would fill with worse things than the truth, probably. He stood up from the desk slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the last of the storm was retreating to the east, and the night air smelled washed clean. "She was killed," he said, with a careful flatness to his voice that she recognized as the sound of someone who has had to tell a fact many times and has stripped all the emotion from it in order to survive the telling. There was a man who had worked the ranch for a season, who believed he had a grievance with me over wages. He came back 6 months after I let him go. I was away from the house, a pause that stretched long enough to hurt. He set fire to the barn. When Clara ran out to free the horses, he was waiting. The silence after this was absolute, filled only with the distant rumble of the retreating storm. "Hugh," Rebecca said, and her voice was completely different from any tone she had used with him before, raw and quiet. "She died before I got back," he said, still at the window, still with that terrible, careful flatness. "By the time I reached her, there was nothing to be done." "And the man?" Rebecca asked. "Gone. He was found 8 months later in Colorado by the territorial marshal. He was tried and hanged." A brief pause. "That was supposed to be the end of it." "But it was not," she said. "Not a question." "No," he said, "it was not." He turned from the window then and looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not self-pity or the performance of grief. It was something more specific and more damaging. Guilt. Not the reasonable grief of a man who had lost someone he loved, but the particular poison of a man who had decided, somewhere in the nightmare of that loss, that he was responsible for it. That if he had been there, if he had handled the dismissed worker differently, if he had any number of things, his wife would still be alive. Rebecca understood then what Mrs. Garfield had not been able to tell her, and what the expression on Deke's face every morning contained. They were worried about Hugh not because he was dangerous or unpredictable, but because he was a man who had decided on some private level that he did not deserve to be happy again. That happiness itself was a kind of betrayal. She said none of this. She simply said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded once briefly, the way you nod when you have given something away that cost you greatly, and you are not sure whether you regret it. She went to bed that night with her thoughts arranged in a careful line, and in the morning she woke before dawn, the way she always did, and lay in the room with the better view and watched the Wyoming sky go from black to purple to gold, and she made several decisions. She was going to stay. She was going to know this man properly, all of him, including the parts he had decided were too broken to offer anyone. And she was going to do it not because she pitied him. She would not insult either of them that way, but because in 2.5 weeks she had seen enough of Hugh Slater to understand that the man behind the walls was extraordinary, and she was not in the habit of walking away from extraordinary things because they were difficult. The following weeks had a different quality. Not dramatically different, not the kind of change that announces itself, but a gradual deepening, like a river that has been running shallow and suddenly finds deeper ground. She stopped being careful in quite the same way. She let herself laugh more freely when something struck her as funny, and she found that Hugh's own sense of humor, which was very dry and occasionally surprising, emerged more readily in response to hers. They argued about books, which was one of the great pleasures of her life, and which she had never been able to do properly with anyone who had not read widely enough to argue back, and Hugh argued back with a precision and a passion that delighted her. She rode with him to check the far fences one morning, and he taught her the particular geography of the ranch, the names he had given to different sections and the reasons for them, and she understood that this was a form of trust, showing her the landscape that was also a map of his mind. She helped him when the chestnut mare foaled, standing in the warm barn in the middle of the night, while the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke overhead, and she held the mare's head and talked to her softly while Hugh worked. And afterward, when the foal was standing on trembling new legs, and the mare was nuzzling it with a wonder that never grew old regardless of how many times you saw it, Hugh looked across the animal at her and smiled, and it was the real smile, the one that reached his eyes. And her heart did something complicated and wonderful in her chest. That night, walking back to the house in the rain, he put his hand briefly on the small of her back to guide her around a muddy patch, and neither of them commented on the contact, but she was aware of his hand for a long time after it was gone. She knew she loved him. She had known it for some time. In the honest and unflinching way she tried to know things, but she let the knowledge settle without rushing it, because some things needed to be exactly right before you acted on them. What she had not anticipated was the complication that arrived in the form of a man named Dale Rudder. Dale Rudder came to Harrow Creek in the third week of September, and the first Rebecca knew of him was when she came down for breakfast one morning and found Hugh standing in the kitchen with an expression on his face that she had not seen before, a tight, controlled version of something that in a less disciplined man might have been fear. "There is someone in town," he said when she came in. "I need to go and deal with it." "Who?" she asked directly because she had earned that right by now. A pause. "A man named Dale Rudder. He is the brother of the man who killed Clara." The kitchen was very quiet. "He came once before," Hugh said, "about a year after what happened. He was angry. He believed, as some people did, that what his brother did was partly my fault, that I had cheated his brother on the wages and driven him to desperation." The careful flatness was back in his voice. "He made threats. He left when Sheriff Baines made it clear his welcome was finished." "And now he is back," Rebecca said. "And now he is back." Hugh reached for his hat. "I am going to go speak to Sheriff Baines." "I am coming with you," she said. He started to object. She could see it forming in his expression. She met his eyes steadily and said nothing, and after a moment he said, "All right." Harrow Creek's sheriff was a broad, careful man named Elias Baines, who had the calm, measured quality of someone who had seen enough of human nature to remain surprised by very little of it. He received Hugh's news about Rudder's presence with the same steady attention he gave everything, and he told Hugh he would keep an eye on the situation, and that if Rudder caused any trouble, he would handle it. "You are not to go looking for trouble yourself," he said to Hugh directly, with the firmness of a man who had said this before and needed it to stick this time. His gaze moved briefly to Rebecca with the measuring look of someone recalibrating his assessment of a situation based on new information. "I understand," Hugh said. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was different from their usual silences, charged and wary. Rebecca thought about what she knew of Dale Rudder, the shape of a man defined by grief and anger and a need to assign blame, and she thought about Hugh, who carried the same grief and had assigned the blame to himself, and she thought about how two people defined by the same event could arrive at such different and equally damaging conclusions. "He is wrong," she said, while they were still half a mile from the ranch. "Rudder is wrong." Hugh did not answer immediately. The horse's hooves made their steady rhythm on the dry ground. "He lost his brother," he said finally. "Yes," she said, "and his brother murdered your wife. Those two things are both true, and the second one does not become less true because the first one is tragic." Another silence. Then, "I know that," he said quietly, in a way that suggested knowing it and believing it were two very different experiences. Rudder appeared at the ranch gate 2 days later. Rebecca was in the garden, which was not much of a garden, but she had been trying to establish one, and she saw the rider coming from the direction of town and knew from the set of Hugh's shoulders, who was mending the fence near the gate, that this was the moment. She set down her trowel and walked toward the gate, because she was not the kind of woman who waited inside while events unfolded without her. Dale Rudder was a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s, with a face that had been organizing itself around bitterness for long enough that the expression had become structural. He stopped his horse just outside the gate and looked down at Hugh with an expression that combined contempt with something rawer. "Slater," he said. "Rudder," Hugh said evenly, "you need to turn around." "I have got things to say," Rudder said. "I have been carrying them for 3 years and I am going to say them." "Saying them will not change anything," Hugh said. "It will not bring your brother back, and it will not change what he did." "My brother was a desperate man," Rudder said, and his voice cracked on it. "He was a desperate man who you pushed over the edge when you shorted his wages." "I did not short his wages," Hugh said, and the calm in his voice was absolute, the calm of someone who has had this argument with himself 1,000 times. "I paid him exactly what we agreed. If he believed otherwise, he was wrong, and what he did because of that belief was still murder. Rutter's eyes moved to Rebecca, standing a few feet behind Hugh. The assessment in his gaze was not pleasant. "And you have got yourself a new woman already," he said, with a contempt designed to wound. "Moved right on past what happened to Clara, have you?" Rebecca saw something shift in Hugh's face at that, something white and hot, the first break in the careful control, and she stepped forward before it could become something else. "Mr. Rutter," she said, clearly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My name is Rebecca Fairchild. I understand you are carrying grief and anger, and I am sorry for your loss, but you will not come to this property and use Clara Slater's memory as a weapon. She deserves better than that, and so does Mr. Slater." Rutter stared at her. He had not expected this. Most people, she suspected, did not speak to Dale Rutter this directly because most people were uncertain whether or not he was genuinely dangerous. "You do not know what you are mixed up in," Rutter said. "I know exactly what I am mixed up in," she said. "And I know that Sheriff Baines in Harrow Creek is aware of your presence in this territory. And I know that if you came here with intentions that go beyond unfortunate conversation, you have made a very serious miscalculation." There was a long moment in which the three of them existed in a tight constellation of tension, the horses moving slightly, the wind brushing the grass, the mountains watching from their indifferent distance. Then Rutter turned his horse. He rode back toward the road without another word, and Rebecca watched until he was gone, and then she turned to Hugh. His expression was something she had no word for. It was not gratitude exactly or surprise exactly. It was more fundamental than either. It was the expression of a man seeing something clearly for the first time. "That was," he started and stopped. "Necessary," she supplied. "Yes," he agreed. "Among other things." They reported the visit to Sheriff Baines that afternoon, and Baines visited Rutter at his lodging in town, and made clear that any further approach to the Slater property would result in immediate consequences. Rutter left Harrow Creek the following morning, and Rebecca found out from Mrs. Garfield in town a week later that he had gone back to Colorado. Whether he would stay gone was an open question, but it was not the immediate question, and Rebecca had learned to deal with immediate questions first. What followed Rutter's departure was a change in the atmosphere of the ranch and of her relationship with Hugh that she had not anticipated, because the intensity of that confrontation had stripped away some of the careful propriety they had been maintaining and left something more honest in its place. He came to find her the evening after Rutter left, while she was in the parlor with a book she was not really reading, and he sat down in the chair across from her with a directness of purpose that she recognized as significant. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said, and put the book down. "What I said to Rutter about not having shorted his brother's wages, that is the truth. I have lived with the question of whether I did something, anything, that contributed to what happened, and the answer is that I did not. I discharged a man who was not performing his work and was causing problems among the other hands, and I paid him what he was owed, and he chose to do what he did out of a pride that had curdled into something violent. I did not cause that." He said it with the careful deliberateness of someone saying a thing out loud for the first time in its complete form, not just acknowledging the fact but actually claiming it. "No," Rebecca said, "you did not. I have spent 3 years believing that I should have been there," he continued, "and that if I had been there I could have stopped it. And that is also not entirely true because I had no warning, and if I had been there he might have killed us both. But I have let myself believe it because it was easier than believing that sometimes terrible things happen, and the only thing you did wrong was not being omniscient." Rebecca was quiet, listening. "I sent for you because Deke told me I needed to stop living like a man who is already dead," Hugh said, and the rawness in his voice now was real and unguarded in a way she had not heard from him before. "And because the advertisement I placed was honest, which is the only way I know how to do things, and your first letter was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in 3 years, and I thought that whatever happened I could at least try." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "And now I am in considerable difficulty," he said, "because I had not anticipated caring about you this much, and I do not know what to do with that." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the parlor was low and warm, casting the room in amber and shadow, and the Wyoming night outside was enormous and full of stars, and she was aware of being in exactly the right place, even if getting here had required considerable pain. "You do not have to know what to do with it right this moment," she said. "You just have to stop running from it." "I am not running," he said. "You are sitting very still," she said, "which is a different way of running." He almost smiled at that. Almost. Then he said, "If you knew everything that I carry, you might feel differently." "Then tell me everything," she said simply. He told her. Over the course of several evenings, in the way a man unloads something heavy, carefully, piece by piece, so as not to drop it all at once. He told her about his marriage to Clara, how they had met in Denver, how they had been happy in the simple, daily way that is the most reliable kind of happiness, and how he had been blindsided by her death in a way that had required him to fundamentally rebuild his sense of what the world was and what his place in it could be. He told her about the months after, which had been darker than he was comfortable describing, and she understood from the gaps in the telling exactly how dark. He told her about the slow recovery, the ranch as a form of salvation because it required constant attention and gave him no choice but to keep moving, and Deke's stubborn, unspoken refusal to let him give up, which had been more valuable than he had words for. And she told him things too, in the way these exchanges work, equal weight in both directions. She told him about Arthur Crenshaw with more detail than she had given before, about the particular humiliation of realizing that someone you had trusted had been exploiting that trust from the beginning, and about the anger that had followed and that she had turned, carefully and deliberately, into something useful, into independence, into the clear-eyed pragmatism that people sometimes mistook for coldness, but was actually a form of self-respect. "You are not cold," he said after one of these evenings when the house was quiet and the lamp between them was burning low. "No," she agreed. "I am careful." "There is a difference," he said. "A significant one," she said. He reached across the table then, slowly, and covered her hand with his. His hand was large and warm and held hers with a gentleness that was not at all what the size and roughness of it would have suggested, and she felt the warmth of it spread up her arm and into her chest. "Rebecca," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think I am going to be in love with you," he said, with the particular honesty of a man who is observing something factual about his own experience rather than performing a declaration. "If I am not already, which I suspect I might be." She turned her hand over under his and linked her fingers through his. "I have been there for some time," she told him, equally factual, equally honest. He looked at her then with something that was new in his face, something that did not have the weight of protection or performance or careful distance in it. It was simply and entirely him looking at her. He had kissed her that night, gently and with a care that was its own kind of eloquence, and she had kissed him back, and the Wyoming dark outside pressed against the windows and held the whole moment in. And then, 3 days after that, everything came undone. She had not heard the exchange. She had been upstairs when a rider came to the ranch, a young man from town with a message for Hugh, and she came down to find Hugh in the kitchen with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression on his face that she recognized as the one he wore when he was rebuilding the walls. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her and she saw the battle happening behind his eyes. "A letter," he said, "from Clara's family, her parents in Ohio." "And," she said. He put the letter on the table. She read it. Clara's mother, a woman named Edith Hallbrook, had written to say that she had heard Hugh had sent for a woman, that people in Harrow Creek had apparently written to relatives, and word traveled in the way of small connected communities, and that she was writing to express her belief that it was too soon, that Clara had only been gone 3 years, and that any woman who replaced Clara so quickly was not honoring what had been lost. Rebecca put the letter down and looked at Hugh. His face was composed and terrible. "She is in pain," Rebecca said carefully. "She is grieving." Yes, he said, she is also right. She is not right, Rebecca said. She is grieving and she is wrong, and those are not mutually exclusive. 3 years is not a long time, he said, and she could hear in his voice that Edith Holbrook's letter had struck exactly the place that was already wounded, the place that said he was moving forward too fast, that happiness was disloyal, that he did not deserve what was happening between him and Rebecca. Hugh, she said. I brought you here, he said, and that was not fair to you. I was not in a position to offer you what an advertisement like that implied, and I should have waited until I was certain I was ready, and I was not certain, and now I have put you in a situation where— Hugh, she said again more firmly. Stop, he stopped. I'm a grown woman of 26 years, she said. I read your letters, I made my own decision to come here. Whatever position I am in, I place myself in it with full knowledge and full consent. You do not get to decide that I was deceived or that I am a victim of your insufficient readiness. That is not your determination to make about my life. His jaw tightened. I care about you, he said, and the words were rough and raw. Which is precisely why I cannot. You cannot what? She said. Cannot let yourself be happy. Cannot believe that you have served enough penance for something that was not your fault. Cannot trust that I know my own mind. It is not that simple, he said. It is exactly that simple, she said, and you are making it complicated because it is less frightening to be guilty than to be free. They were standing 3 feet apart in the kitchen, and the air between them was charged with everything they had built in the past 6 weeks and the terrible possibility of its collapse. He looked at her and she could see the war in him, the man who had kissed her 3 nights ago and the man who had decided, before she arrived and in the lonely dark spaces of 3 years of grief, that he did not deserve to be kissed again. I am sorry, he said. And then he said the words she had been dreading. I do not think I deserve a second chance, Rebecca. Not at this. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that was how Rebecca Fairchild came to be standing outside the Slater ranch house in the fading evening light with a cocked pistol pressed against the chest of the most infuriating, extraordinary man she had ever encountered, demanding that he say it again to her face. She had not actually planned to shoot him. The gun had been in her hand because she had been cleaning it, something she did every week because she believed in being practical about self-defense in a territory where self-defense was occasionally relevant. And when he had said those words to her in the kitchen, she had simply walked out of the house still holding it, not as a threat, but as an extension of the fury that had nowhere else to go. He had followed her out, and now they were here. His hand was around the barrel of the gun and his eyes were on hers, and the evening was enormous around them. Then God help you, he had said, because the truth is going to be worse than you think. She uncocked the gun with a careful click and stepped back. Tell me the rest of it, she said. Whatever you have been holding back, all of it. He released the barrel. He rubbed his face with both hands in a gesture of exhaustion that was completely unguarded, and then he looked at her with an expression that was the most naked she had ever seen on a human face. There is more, he said. About Clara's death. Rebecca waited. The man who killed her, he said, Rutter's brother, his name was Tom Rutter. He came back because of the wages dispute, yes, but there was more to it than that. He came back because he knew something about me and Clara, and he believed he could use it. Rebecca felt the world slow down slightly. What did he know, she said. Clara and I, Hugh said, and started again. In the last year of our marriage we were struggling. Not with love, the love was still there, but with something else. She was not happy in Wyoming. She had not been for some time. She missed Ohio, she missed her family, she missed the life she had known. We argued about it. We were trying to find a way forward, whether she might spend some months in Ohio with her family, whether I might consider selling the ranch and moving east. He stopped. Tom Rutter overheard one of our arguments. He later told one of the other hands, bragged about it, that he had heard us and believed I was planning to leave Clara, and that he had decided he was going to approach her separately, to offer her a way out of a bad situation. The words were coming out of him now with the particular release of a pressure that has been contained too long. He wanted her for himself. He had convinced himself, with the peculiar logic of an obsessed man, that I was the obstacle to something that was rightfully his. When I dismissed him over the wages, it became the trigger for everything he had been building toward. The evening air was very still. "So he did not come back just to threaten you," Rebecca said slowly. "He came back for her," Hugh said, "and she ran from him. She ran toward the barn because there was a rifle in the barn, because she was not a woman who waited for things to happen to her either, a pause that contained years. She almost made it." Rebecca understood now the full weight of what Hugh carried. Not just the loss of his wife, but the knowledge that in the moment of Clara's death, she had been attempting to defend herself, and the knowledge that a man's obsession had turned the ordinary unhappiness of a marriage finding its way through difficulty into a catastrophe, and the guilt of knowing that if he had dismissed Tom Rutter differently, less directly, or had not dismissed him at all, or had been home that day, the cascade would not have begun. "You could not have known," she said. "No," he said. "But knowing is not the only way to feel responsible." "Hugh," she said, and her voice was very gentle now, the anger burned down to its essential truth, which was that the anger had been made of love, which was why it had burned so hot. Clara was in a difficult marriage that was nevertheless a good marriage between two people who were trying. She was unhappy in a place, not with a person. That is a solvable problem. You were solving it. Tom Rutter's obsession was not your creation, and not her fault, and not the logical consequence of your marriage having any ordinary difficulty. It was the act of a man with a hidden darkness that neither of you could have seen clearly. He was silent. "And Edith Holbrook's grief," she continued, "is real, and it is valid, and it is also being aimed at you like a weapon, and you are letting it hit you because you agree with it on some level, because it confirms what you already believe, which is that you were responsible for Clara's death and therefore do not deserve to be happy." She stepped toward him. "And I am telling you, Hugh Slater, standing right here in the most beautiful and God-forsaken piece of land I have ever seen, that you are wrong. And I am not a woman who says things she does not believe." He looked at her for a very long time. The mountains had gone dark behind him, just shapes now against a sky that was filling with stars, the great Wyoming darkness settling in. "You," he said very quietly, "are the most remarkable person I have ever met." "I know," she said without false modesty, "and you would be making a significant error to let me walk away." "I did not say anything about walking away," he said. "You said you did not deserve a second chance," she reminded him. "I said it," he agreed. "And you said you would be the judge of that." "I did." "And what is your judgment?" he asked. She looked at him steadily, this man with all his weight and all his worth and all his carefully held damage. "My judgment," she said, "is that you deserve it very much, and that the question is not whether you deserve it but whether you are brave enough to take it." The silence after that was different from any silence they had shared before. It was the silence of a door opening. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her in a way that was different from 3 nights ago. Not gentle now, but certain. The kiss of a man who has made a decision and is no longer at war with himself about it. She kissed him back with equal certainty, her hands curling into the front of his shirt, and the Wyoming stars multiplied overhead. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead against hers and breathed. She could feel the tremor in his hands against her face, the release of something that had been held for a very long time. "I need you to understand something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I am going to write to Edith Holbrook," he said. "I am going to tell her that I will always honor Clara's memory and that honoring it does not require me to stop living. And I am going to tell her that if she wishes to have a relationship with me going forward, it will have to accommodate that. A breath. And then I am going to ask you to marry me, if you will have me." She pulled back enough to look at him clearly. "Was that the question?" she said. "Because I have heard more formal proposals from men I cared considerably less about." He laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, the first she had heard from him, and it transformed the night into something spectacular. "Rebecca Fairchild," he said, still laughing slightly, still holding her face, Will you marry me? I am not an easy man. I have considerable damage and ongoing guilt about said damage, and a tendency to process emotion approximately 3 weeks after it occurs. But I am honest and I am capable and I love you, and I believe we would be remarkable together. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. They were married on a Saturday in October 1882, in the church that leaned slightly to the left in Harrow Creek, in a ceremony conducted by a minister named Reverend Brooks, who was accustomed to performing frontier weddings and kept things efficient and heartfelt in equal measure. The gathering was small but genuine. Deke Hollies was there, standing with the solid presence of a man who had waited a long time for this particular day and was quietly, privately satisfied about it. Mrs. Garfield was there, beaming with a warmth that suggested she had been invested in this outcome for some weeks. Sheriff Baines attended, having developed a quiet regard for Rebecca since the Rudder business. A handful of the ranch hands were in the back pews, cleaned up and uncomfortable in their good clothes in the way of men who rarely wore them. Rebecca wore a blue dress she had ordered from the general store's catalog, having refused to be married in anything she had arrived in, and her dark hair was pinned up with a comb she had brought from Kansas City, and she walked to the front of that leaning church alone because there was no one to walk with her, which suited her fine because she had been walking on her own for long enough that it felt natural, and she did not consider it a lack. Hugh was waiting for her at the front, in a dark suit that fit him so well she suspected Deke had intervened with Mrs. Alcott on the matter of its fit, and he was looking at her with the expression she had come to think of as his real face, the one without the armor, open and certain and wholly present. The ceremony was straightforward, and they meant every word of it. After the wedding, there was a small celebration at the church hall, with food that the women of Harrow Creek had contributed with the communal generosity of small western towns that understood that celebrations were shared property, and music from a fiddle player named Clarence who was very good and knew it, but was willing to be enjoyed anyway. Rebecca danced with Hugh and then with Deke and then with the sheriff, who was surprisingly light on his feet, and then with Hugh again, and the evening had the quality of something that could not have been planned but felt, in its accumulation, inevitable. They drove home to the double S under stars that seemed close enough to reach, the night air cold now with the edge of autumn, and Hugh had a blanket over her shoulders before she thought to ask for one, and the horses knew the way home so they could leave them to it and simply sit with the intimacy of the night and the sound of the wheels and the stars. "Are you happy?" he asked her, in the way a man asks a question he already knows the answer to but wants to hear anyway. "Enormously," she said, and leaned against his shoulder. The months that followed were the kind of months that write themselves into the bones of a life and stay there. Rebecca settled into the double S not as a visitor finding her place, but as a woman taking possession of something she had earned and intended to keep. She took over the ranch accounts completely, and with Hugh's enthusiastic support, because it turned out that the combination of her precision and his knowledge of the cattle business produced results that were considerably better than either of them managed separately. She established a kitchen garden that survived the Wyoming autumn and planned to expand it in spring. She wrote to her former students in Kansas City, several of whom had parents who wrote back, and she discovered through this correspondence that the daughter of one of her former colleagues was looking for a teaching position, and she began advocating with the Harrow Creek Town Council, through Mrs. Garfield, and through the considerable social force she was quietly accumulating, for the establishment of a proper school. She also wrote, carefully and without animosity, to Edith Holbrook in Ohio. The letter had taken 3 drafts. In the end she wrote, "I want you to know that your daughter is honored in this house. Her books are on the shelf and her photograph is on the mantel, and her memory is treated with the respect and love it deserves. Hugh carries his grief for Clara quietly, as he carries everything, but he carries it with integrity. I'm not here to replace her, and I would not insult her memory by trying. I am here because Hugh and I found each other and chose each other with clear eyes, and I believe that is something Clara, who knew how to love deeply, would understand. Edith Holbrook wrote back 4 months later, a short letter stiff in its careful language, but it was a response, and it was not hostile, and it acknowledged Rebecca's existence without denying her right to it. It was a beginning, and Rebecca was patient with beginnings. Hugh wrote the letter he had promised to Edith separately, and it was the kind of letter only a man capable of great honesty could write. He did not share its exact contents with Rebecca, but he told her what he had said, which was essentially the same thing: that his love for Clara had been real and remained real, that grief was not a finite resource that emptied when happiness returned, that he intended to live the rest of his life with the woman he had married and to live it fully, and that he hoped Edith would, in time, find room for that. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a hard one across Wyoming territory, with snow that came early and stayed late, and tested every ranch from the Bighorn Basin to the territorial line. The double S came through it well, partly because Hugh's cattle management was sound, and partly because Rebecca had identified, in the autumn, a weakness in their hay storage that she had insisted on addressing before the first snow. Several of their neighbors were not as fortunate, and there were difficult weeks in February when the temperature dropped to something brutal, and the wind came off the mountains with a cruelty that made the concept of summer feel like a memory from someone else's life. During those weeks they were confined to the house for long stretches, and this proved, if anything, to be confirmation that they were the right people for each other, because rather than creating tension, the confinement produced a richness of conversation and a domestic ease that suggested they had been sharing a space for decades rather than months. Hugh was teaching her chess, which she was learning with a systematic efficiency that clearly both delighted and alarmed him. She was teaching him to play the small piano that had been in the parlor when she arrived, and that she had discovered worked adequately if you did not demand too much of the upper register. They read to each other in the evenings. He had a voice for reading, deep and even, and she discovered that Whitman sounded entirely different read aloud than it did on the page. She found herself looking at him across the room sometimes, in the ordinary moments, when he was reading or working at the desk, or just sitting by the fire with a coffee cup, and feeling something so settled and so complete that it startled her with its size. She had not known love could feel like this. She had known it could feel urgent and frightening and exhilarating, but this particular feeling was something else. The feeling of having arrived at a place you had not known you were traveling toward, and discovering it was exactly where you needed to be. In March she told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast directly, because that was how she told him everything. She watched his face go through approximately 4 different expressions in 2 seconds, and then he stood up from the table so fast he knocked his coffee cup over and did not notice, and he came around the table and took her by the shoulders and looked at her with an expression that was half disbelief and half something that made her eyes sting in spite of herself. "Are you certain?" he asked. "The doctor confirmed it last week," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I told you." "Last week," he repeated. "You have known since last week, and I wanted to be certain," she said again. He pulled her into his arms then and held her with a tenderness and a fierceness combined that was characteristic of everything he did. She could feel his breathing against her hair, the slight unevenness of it. "We are going to have a child," he said quietly into her hair. "We are," she agreed. A long pause. "Clara and I tried," he said carefully. "It did not happen for us." She held him more tightly. "I know," she said. He had told her this in one of the late-night conversations of winter. "I want you to know," he said equally carefully, "that whatever that I am already," he stopped, started over. "You are already everything. Whatever comes after is a gift I had not let myself imagine." She pulled back enough to look at him. His eyes were bright, and Hugh Slater was not a man who cried easily, which made the brightness significant. "Say something less terrifyingly formal," she told him. He laughed, the real laugh, and the brightness in his eyes resolved into joy. "I am delighted," he said. "I am absolutely and completely delighted. Is that better?" "Much," she said. The pregnancy was healthy. Rebecca refused to become fragile about it, continuing her morning rides until they became uncomfortable, and then transitioning to walking, continuing her work on the accounts and her campaign for the school and her correspondence with everyone from Edith Hallbrook to her former colleagues in Kansas City. She was tired sometimes and occasionally impossible to feed because nothing smelled right, and Hugh learned very quickly to keep crackers in the kitchen at all times and to say nothing about dinner if she came home and announced she could not eat whatever had been made. The school happened in May. A young woman named Frances Webb arrived from Kansas City, 23 years old, and possessed of the particular combination of gentleness and determination that Rebecca recognized as the hallmark of a good teacher. Rebecca met her stage and introduced her to the town and helped her settle into the small house that had been made available, and when she showed her the one-room schoolhouse that had been hastily constructed through communal effort and a small territorial grant, Frances Webb's face lit up with an unguarded delight that told Rebecca everything she needed to know about the decision to recruit her. In September 1883, Rebecca gave birth to a boy. It was a long labor, harder than she had expected because she had approached it with the same pragmatism she approached everything, and the reality of it required a recalibration that was beyond the reach of pragmatism. Mrs. Garfield served as midwife, competent and steady, and Hugh was not permitted in the room, which was the custom of the time, and Deke sat with him on the porch through the long hours and neither of them talked very much. But Deke refilled Hugh's coffee cup without being asked, and that was its own form of conversation. When Mrs. Garfield came out to the porch and said the words that meant both mother and child were safe and well, Hugh gripped the porch railing with both hands and took a breath so long and ragged that Deke put a hand on his shoulder and left it there. Hugh was allowed in when Rebecca was settled. He came through the door of the room with the better view, and she was in the bed with the child in her arms, and the child was red-faced and indignant in the way of the newly born, and when Hugh sat down beside her and she placed the baby in his arms, his face did what it sometimes did in the most unguarded moments of emotion. It became entirely open, entirely undefended, entirely him. "He looks furious," Hugh said softly. "He is having a difficult morning," Rebecca said. He held the baby with the careful, wondering attention of a man holding something he had not been sure he would be allowed to hold, and Rebecca watched him and felt the wholeness of the moment with every part of herself. "What shall we call him?" Hugh asked. They had discussed this and had not quite settled it. Rebecca had suggestions but was curious what Hugh would say in this particular moment. "I thought," Hugh said slowly, not looking up from the face of the baby, "Thomas. Not for Tom Rutter, but because it was my father's name. If that sits right with you." "Thomas," Rebecca said, trying it. "Thomas Slater," she nodded. "It sits very right." "Thomas James Slater," Hugh said, which had a weight and a rightness to it that settled into the room like something permanent. Thomas James Slater was, from the very beginning, a person of significant opinions and limited patience for having them frustrated. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's refusal to be diverted from his immediate concerns, and the combination produced a child who was, as Deke put it with the gravity of a man making a professional assessment, going to be a great deal of work. He was also extraordinary. Rebecca had not anticipated the specific quality of loving a child, which was different from every other form of love she had experienced, and which arrived fully formed and without negotiation, absolute and non-rational in a way that she, who prided herself on rationality, found completely upending and completely fine. Hugh was magnificent with him. This was not something Rebecca had calculated or predicted, though she had hoped for it. He was patient in a way that his general directness of character did not initially suggest, and he had the instinct for when a child needed to be settled versus stimulated, for when the crying was discomfort versus frustration versus genuine distress. He was present in a way that the ordinary demands of the ranch might have made difficult, but which he managed by reorganizing his mornings to allow time with Thomas before the day's work began. A small but significant daily choice that Rebecca noted and loved. He also, in the spring following Thomas's birth, did something she had not expected. He wrote again to Edith Holbrook, this time to tell her that he had a son, and to invite her to visit Harrow Creek if she ever wished to see the life that had been built in Wyoming. The invitation was extended without pressure and without expectation, simply as an open door. Edith Holbrook arrived in August 1884, on the same stage line that had brought Rebecca almost 2 years before, a small, gray-haired woman with Clara's eyes and a manner that was cautious and proud in equal measure. She was met at the stage stop not by a buckboard but by Hugh and Rebecca together, with Thomas in Rebecca's arms, and the moment when Edith Holbrook saw the child and something in her face shifted from its careful guardedness was one of the most quietly significant moments Rebecca had witnessed. Edith stayed 2 weeks. The first few days were careful, the conversation managed, and the silences monitored, the way all complicated relationships begin their negotiations. But by the 3rd day, Edith was in the parlor with Thomas, who was by this point 10 months old and deeply invested in any new person willing to give him unstructured attention. And by the end of the week, she was helping Rebecca in the kitchen with the particular ease of women who have found their way past the managed distance into the comfortable real. She and Hugh had a conversation that Rebecca was not present for, long enough that dinner was late and the food dried out, and no one mentioned it. Afterward, Hugh came into the kitchen where Rebecca was pretending to be busy, and he said, simply, "She is going to be all right." Rebecca nodded. "I know," she said. "She told me," he said, and stopped. "She told me that Clara would have liked you." Rebecca set down the pot she was holding and looked at her husband. The lamp was warm and yellow, and the house held all of them, the man she loved and the woman who had traveled from Ohio to find the courage to acknowledge that love was larger than grief. "I think I would have liked Clara," Rebecca said. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." Edith Holbrook went back to Ohio with a dozen letters to write and photographs of her grandson, and an arrangement to visit the following summer, which she kept. The relationship she and Rebecca built over the following years was not without its complications, because 2 strong-minded women with deeply different relationships to the same man and the same history were never going to find each other simple. But it was honest and it was real, and honesty and realness were the foundations on which Rebecca built everything. Dale Rutter did not come back. Word came through Sheriff Baines's network of territorial contacts that he had died in the winter of 1883, a hard winter across Colorado as it had been across Wyoming, and the news arrived without drama and without resolution, which was the way most of the world's complicated stories ended. Not with a confrontation or a reconciliation, but simply with an ending, the world moving forward without finishing the sentence. Rebecca allowed herself to grieve, briefly and practically, not for Rutter himself, but for the possibility of resolution that his death made permanently unavailable, and then she put it away because there was too much living happening to spend time on what could not be changed. The ranch grew. In 1884, they expanded the horse breeding operation, which had been Deke's territory and passion, and which responded to proper investment and attention, by becoming one of the better small breeding operations in Wyoming territory. Rebecca managed the business side of this expansion with the same precision she brought to everything financial, and the combination of her systems and Deke's expertise and Hugh's network of contacts among the ranching community produced results that surprised even the most optimistic projections. In 1885, Rebecca established the Harrow Creek Ladies' Reading Circle, which was considerably less genteel than the name suggested, and which served as the primary vehicle by which the women of the town and its surrounding ranches organized collective responses to problems that the town's formal governance was too slow or too disinterested to address. The school's continued funding, the establishment of a proper medical practice when the territory's only doctor retired, the advocacy for mail service that was reliable enough to actually be called a service. All of these were, at their foundation, products of conversations that began at the reading circle with a book and ended with a plan. Frances Webb, the schoolteacher, became one of Rebecca's closest friends. She was 23 when she arrived and 26 when she fell in love with a young veterinarian named Samuel Price, who had come to Harrow Creek with the particular ambition of establishing himself somewhere that genuinely needed him. And their courtship was observed by the reading circle with the same collective investment that small communities bring to the romantic lives of their members, which is to say with interest, advice, and strong opinions. Rebecca maintained a careful neutrality on the subject of whether Frances should accept Samuel's proposal, while making it very clear in private that she thought Samuel was exactly the right kind of serious-minded, gentle man that Frances deserved. And the wedding in the spring of 1886 was one of the happier events in a year that required some happiness as counterweight. Thomas learned to ride before he learned to read, which would have been a point of mild professional concern for Rebecca, the former schoolteacher, if she had not been fully aware that he was absorbing language and story with the same intensity he brought to everything else, simply through the medium of listening to his parents' conversations and requesting that his father read to him for as long as each evening could stretch. Hugh read to Thomas with the same patient voice he used for everything, and Rebecca would come and sit in the doorway sometimes, leaning against the frame, and watch the two of them in the lamplight with Thomas tucked against his father's side, and a book open across both their laps, and the feeling that came over her in those moments was beyond her ability to name precisely. It was something like gratitude but larger. Something like wonder at the specific improbability of everything that had led to this exact moment in this exact place. In 1886, the Wyoming Territory was changing. The big cattle barons were consolidating power in ways that were beginning to create genuine friction with the smaller ranchers, and the political landscape of the territory was shifting toward tensions that everyone could feel even if no one could yet predict their shape. Hugh was not a man who became political easily, but he was a man who paid attention. And he became involved in the Wyoming Stock Growers Association less as an enthusiast than as a strategist, because he understood that the interests of the smaller independent ranchers needed a voice that could work within the existing structures without being swallowed by them. Rebecca supported this involvement and was, privately, one of its most effective contributors, because the reading circle had become a genuine information network, and the relationships she had built with women across the territory's ranching community gave her access to intelligence about conditions and attitudes that the formal association meetings did not surface. She and Hugh talked about these things at dinner, and in the evenings with the same directness they brought to everything, two people who had decided long ago that they were partners in the complete sense of the word. Thomas was 3.5 when Rebecca told Hugh she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening, after Thomas was in bed, sitting by the fire with her embroidery in her lap, a domestic scene so ordinary that the news arrived in it like a warm light turning up a degree. "Again," he said, and smiled, and the smile was different from the first time, less stunned and more purely happy because the second time around he knew exactly what he was glad about. "In the spring," she said. He came and sat beside her on the settee and put his arm around her. She leaned into him, the way she had learned to lean into him in the particular way that worked, her head just under his jaw. "A brother or a sister for Thomas," he said. "He will be opinionated about either," she said. "He is opinionated about everything," Hugh said, with a parental pride he made no effort to disguise. In April 1887, A leaner Margaret Slater arrived with considerably less drama than her brother and a temperament that suggested she intended to compensate for this early compliance by having opinions about everything for the rest of her life. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's quality of absolute focus, and Thomas, who had been prepared for her arrival with extensive and possibly excessive parental explanation, regarded her for the first day with great skepticism, and by the second day had appointed himself her primary guardian and was instructing Deke on the subject of appropriate behavior around babies. Deke received these instructions with the patience of a man who had been handling large and occasionally unreasonable animals for 40 years. The year Alina was born was also the year Rebecca received, through the Territorial Postal Service, a letter that she had not expected. It was from Arthur Crenshaw. He was in St. Louis, apparently. The widow he had relocated with had proven, in the fullness of time, to have her own opinions about the management of her assets, and the subsequent legal proceedings had been resolved in a manner that left Arthur considerably diminished and apparently moved to something resembling reflection. His letter was not, exactly, an apology. It was too carefully constructed and too aware of its own rhetorical strategy to be a genuine apology. But it acknowledged, in its managed way, that he had treated her badly, and it conveyed that he had heard of her marriage and her circumstances in Wyoming and wished her well. Rebecca read it twice, put it on the desk, and then went about her day. That evening she told Hugh about it because she told him everything of significance. "What do you intend to do about it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said simply. "It is not a letter that requires a response." He looked at her steadily. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and she was. It was interesting, actually, to notice how completely all right she was. The Arthur Crenshaw situation had once been a source of pain and humiliation that she had carried the way you carry an injury, carefully, protecting it from further contact. Now it was simply history, the kind that explained how you arrived somewhere without retaining any power over where you were going. "It is interesting to receive a letter like that," she said, "when you are standing somewhere you could not have imagined being when the thing it refers to happened." "Where are you standing?" Hugh asked. She looked around the parlor, with its fire and its books, and the faint sound of Thomas's voice from upstairs where he was doing something he had not been specifically forbidden from doing, but which she suspected the spirit of the household rules did not endorse. She looked at Hugh across the room, her husband of 5 years, this man who had nearly refused himself the life they had built because he had decided the verdict before the evidence was in. "Somewhere extraordinarily good," she said. He crossed the room and kissed her, briefly, and with a warmth that was entirely habitual and entirely genuine, the kiss of a man who had not stopped choosing his wife from the first day of choosing her. The Wyoming Territory became the state of Wyoming in July 1890, the 44th state admitted to the Union, and notably the first to grant women the right to vote, a distinction that the reading circle celebrated with considerable energy, and a formal dinner at which Rebecca gave a speech that was both eloquent and pointed, and that was reported, somewhat to her surprise, in the Cheyenne Daily Leader. The speech was about the relationship between independence and partnership, which was a subject she had been thinking about, in various forms, since long before the reading circle or Wyoming statehood. It was her belief, stated publicly and without apology, that a woman's right to self-determination was not in conflict with her capacity for deep partnership with another person, that in fact the quality of real partnership, the kind built on mutual respect and genuine equality of mind, required precisely the independence that the vote represented. She said this looking out at a room full of women who had built lives in a landscape that did not accommodate fragility, and she said it thinking about a man with dark eyes who had kissed her in the Wyoming dark after she had held a gun to his chest and told him she would be the judge of what he deserved. Thomas was 7 years old when Wyoming became a state, and Alina was 3, and they both attended the celebration in Harrow Creek with their parents. Thomas, who was already developing the particular combination of his mother's directness and his father's depth that was going to make him an interesting adult, asked Hugh with great seriousness what it meant that Wyoming was a state now. "It means," Hugh said, with equal seriousness, "that the people who live here have more say in how it is governed." "Even Mama?" Thomas asked. "Especially your mother," Hugh said. Thomas considered this and appeared to find it appropriate. Eleanor, for her part, climbed into Deke's arms and announced that she was hungry, which was her standard response to events whose significance she had not yet determined, and Deke fed her a piece of the celebration cake that was intended for the general gathering rather than one specific child, and neither he nor Eleanor showed any remorse about this. Rebecca watched her family in the noise and warmth of the Harrow Creek celebration and thought about the woman she had been on the stage from Kansas City 6 years ago, with her carpetbags and her letter and her carefully rebuilt self, going west toward a man she knew only through words on paper. She thought about the gun in her hand and the sunset behind a man who had said he did not deserve a second chance, and the absolute certainty she had felt, even then, that he was wrong. She had been right. She generally was. But being right about Hugh Slater had been a different order of rightness from the usual kind, because it had required not just accuracy of judgment but the willingness to make that judgment matter, to stand in the face of his conviction that he was not worth it and simply refuse to accept the premise. She had said she would be the judge of that. She had meant it. And the verdict she had reached, standing in the fading light outside a ranch house in Wyoming, had turned out to be the most consequential decision of her life. She found Hugh in the crowd. He was talking to Sheriff Baines about something related to the new statehood structure, and he had Thomas beside him, and as though he could feel her attention across the room he glanced up and found her eyes, and the look they exchanged over the noise and the celebration and the years was simple and complete. A look that said, "I see you, and it is exactly right." The double S continued. The horses became increasingly the heart of the operation as the cattle market fluctuated through the early 90s, and Deke's expertise, amplified by the investment of the previous years, produced a reputation that extended well beyond Harrow Creek. In 1892, they took a first at the Wyoming Territorial Fair with a 3-year-old sorrel stallion that Deke had been working for 2 years, and the celebration at the Double S that evening included Deke accepting a glass of whiskey. He did not usually drink, and becoming very slightly, very solemnly, and very endearingly sentimental. Frances Webb Price had 2 children by this point, a girl and then a boy, and her husband Samuel had established himself as indispensable to the ranching community in the way that a good veterinarian always does, by being the person called when something is going wrong with the most valuable things people own. Frances continued teaching until her children were old enough to be brought with her to the schoolroom, which was the solution she and Rebecca devised together, and which worked considerably better than the alternative of her stopping entirely. Deke retired from active daily management of the horses in 1893, when his knees decided on his behalf that the daily work required accommodation, but he remained on the Double S in an advisory role that was primarily advisory in title and primarily essential in practice. He had been on the ranch before Hugh owned it, and he would likely be on it long after, and this was simply a fact about the Double S, as fundamental as its location or its fences. He had a comfortable room in the main house that had been offered and accepted without either party making too much of it, because both men knew how to offer and accept important things without making them into occasions for embarrassment. Thomas at 10 was a reader and a writer, and a mathematician of instinctive rather than systematic talent, and he had the quality of genuine curiosity that Rebecca recognized from her own childhood as the sign of a mind that was going to need considerable and ongoing nourishment. She had been providing it since before he could talk, and as he grew into the kind of questions that required real answers, She found herself extending his education deliberately beyond what the Harrow Creek School could offer, not because the school was inadequate, but because Thomas was the particular variety of person for whom adequacy was insufficient. Alina at 6 was a reader of a different kind, deeply invested in stories and in the human meanings contained in them, and she had a quality of empathy that was both her greatest strength and the thing Rebecca most wanted to help her protect from being used against her. Because empathetic women in the world she was growing into were often treated as resources rather than people. Rebecca started teaching her very early that caring deeply about others and maintaining clear boundaries about how others treated you were not in conflict. It was the same lesson she had learned from her own experience, and she wanted Alina to learn it earlier and less expensively than she had. Hugh watched his wife with his children and felt things he did not always have words for. He was not a man who lacked language, but the specific quality of watching Rebecca teach their children how to be themselves, with such precision and such love and such complete refusal to make them into something other than what they were, required a different register than his usual vocabulary. He told her this once simply, and she looked at him with the expression she wore when she was genuinely moved and trying not to show it, and she said, "You do the same thing, in a different way." "I just try not to make them afraid of things," he said. "That is a significant part of it," she said. In 1894, a letter arrived from Ohio. It was from Edith Holbrook, who had been corresponding with Rebecca for more than 10 years now, and whose letters had evolved from their initial careful management into something considerably more genuine. The letter said that Edith's health was declining, and that she hoped to make one more visit to Wyoming before she could no longer travel, and that she wanted to see Thomas and Alina and the life that had been built at the Double S. She arrived in May, thinner than the last time and slower, but with Clara's eyes still sharp and full of the intelligence that had always been there. And the visit lasted 3 weeks, and was the kind of visit that does the work of years in the compression of its attention. On the last evening, when the children were in bed and Hugh was seeing to some matter in the barn, Rebecca and Edith sat on the porch in the warm May evening, and Edith said something that Rebecca carried with her for the rest of her life. "I was wrong about you," Edith said, with the directness of a woman who had decided that the time remaining for managed language was insufficient. "When I heard he had sent for a woman, I was angry. I thought it was too soon, and I thought it meant he was trying to forget Clara, and I thought you must be someone who had trapped him while he was still grieving." She paused. "I was wrong about all of it." "You were protecting her memory," Rebecca said. "I was protecting my own grief," Edith said. "There is a difference, and I did not understand it for a long time." She looked out at the Wyoming evening, the mountains going dark against a peach sky, the horses moving in the pasture in the last light. "He is happy," she said, "the way I have not seen him in a very long time, not since before things were difficult with Clara." She turned and looked at Rebecca. She would have been glad of that. Whatever difficulties they had, she loved him, and she would have been glad. Rebecca reached across and took the older woman's hand. They sat that way for some time, the two women who had both loved the same man in entirely different ways and had found, in the long, difficult space of years, something that looked like understanding. Edith Holbrook went back to Ohio in June and died in October of the same year, peacefully, in the house she had always lived in. And the letter informing them of her death arrived in November, and Hugh read it in the study and sat for a while with it. And Rebecca came in and sat across from him, without saying anything, because sometimes silence is the more precise language. The years continued in the way of years on a working ranch, full of seasons and their particular demands, of good times and hard times cycling through with the reliability of weather, of the accumulation of ordinary moments that are the actual substance of a life, as opposed to the dramatic events that punctuate it. Thomas grew into himself with a thoroughness that pleased both his parents and alarmed some of the neighboring ranchers' sons, who found his combination of physical confidence and intellectual appetite somewhat difficult to categorize. He left for the University of Wyoming in Laramie in 1901, 18 years old, and carrying in his bags the intellectual equipment his mother had spent years carefully assembling for him, and the practical wisdom about land and animals and people that his father had provided as the other half of the same education. His departure was not, to Rebecca's surprised relief, the devastation she had been quietly anticipating. She missed him with a fierce and specific love, but she also watched him go with the complete satisfaction of watching something she had helped build operate exactly as it was designed to operate, independently and with purpose. She wrote to him every week, and he wrote back with a thoroughness that told her he had retained more of her correspondence habits than she had given him credit for. Alina at 14 was already the person she was going to be. Fiercely intelligent, deeply empathetic, possessed of opinions, she expressed with a directness that she had clearly inherited, and that made her, in the Harrow Creek schoolroom, a student that Frances Price found by turns challenging and completely wonderful. She had decided she wanted to be a doctor, which was not a common ambition for a girl in Wyoming in 1901, but which was, in the Slater household, treated as a practical problem to be solved rather than an impossible dream to be discouraged. Rebecca spent the winter of 1901 into 1902 researching women's medical colleges, of which there were several by then, and corresponding with admissions offices, and building, brick by brick, the path that Alina would eventually take. Hugh supported this with the same steady backing he gave every project Rebecca undertook that he believed in, which was essentially all of them. In 1903, Deke died. He died in his room in the main house, in his sleep, on an ordinary Wednesday, and the housekeeper found him in the morning and came to tell Hugh, and Hugh came to tell Rebecca, and the grief of it was the particular grief of losing someone who has been so much a part of the fabric of daily life, that their absence creates a silence in the texture of things rather than a single loud gap. He was buried in the Harrow Creek Cemetery on a hill that looked out over the plain toward the mountains, and the attendance at the graveside was larger than anyone had organized for, because Deke Hollies had been part of this community since before most of its current members arrived, and the measure of a life is taken in moments like that, in the gathering of people who do not need to be asked. Hugh spoke at the service, briefly and without performance. He said that Deke had refused to let him give up at a time when giving up had seemed like the most logical available option, and that the life he had built since then was built on that refusal, and that there were no words adequate to the size of that debt. He said it simply and sat down. Rebecca held his hand through the remainder of the service and the walk back, and when they were home, she made tea and they sat in the kitchen in the quiet of a house that felt its absence, and they talked about Deke for a long time, the way you honor people who have gone by keeping them real in the language of specific memory. The double S continued. A young man named Harris took over the horse management, trained in large part by Deke's own patient instruction over his last years of limited but present engagement, and he had both the skill and the respect for what had been built before him that made the transition work. In 1906, Alina left for the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, 20 years old, and as prepared as any person Rebecca had ever seen for the rigors of something she had been building toward for years. Her departure was a significant event in Harrow Creek, covered in the local newspaper as an example of what Wyoming women were capable of, which pleased both Rebecca and Alina for different but overlapping reasons. Thomas came back from Laramie with a degree in land management, and a young woman named Margaret Howell, a rancher's daughter from near Casper, who had her own quiet strength and her own clear eyes, and who met Rebecca and Hugh with the slightly braced quality of a woman who knows she is being assessed and intends to acquit herself with honesty. Rebecca liked her within the first hour and told Hugh so, which made Hugh smile in the way he still smiled when she said exactly what she thought without preamble. Thomas and Margaret were married in the spring of 1905 in Harrow Creek, in the same church that had married Hugh and Rebecca 22 years before, and the church had since been repaired so that it no longer leaned to the left, which was something of a loss romantically but an improvement structurally. The wedding was a considerably larger affair than the one that had preceded it by more than 2 decades, because the Slater name meant something in this part of Wyoming now, and the guest list reflected the accumulation of years and relationships, and the fact that Margaret's family brought their own considerable connections. Rebecca watched her son at the altar with Margaret and felt the full, complicated truth of motherhood in that moment. Pride and love, and the particular letting go that comes when a thing you have given everything to become its own complete thing, independent and capable and entirely itself. Hugh stood beside her and found her hand in the crowd without looking, and she linked her fingers through his, and the gesture was so practiced and so natural that neither of them noticed they had done it until it was already done. They had been married 22 years. The weight that had once sat on Hugh's shoulders like something geological had not disappeared, because the losses that created it were real and permanent, and the dead do not come back. But it had changed its character. It had become the kind of weight that does not impede movement, but is simply part of the structure of a person, load-bearing in the original meaning, the thing that gives a building its integrity. He had become, over those 22 years, a man she knew with a completeness that still managed to surprise her occasionally, because people who are genuinely worth knowing continue to be surprising. He had become someone who trusted joy, which had been the deepest work of all, who did not flinch from happiness, but inhabited it with the same full presence he brought to difficulty, who held the memory of Clara with honesty and love without letting it become a wall between himself and the life still being lived. And she had become, in this life she had chosen so deliberately, something she had not entirely known she was building toward, a woman fully inhabited, fully present in the place and the work and the relationships she had made with her own hands. She was 47 years old, and she looked like what she was, someone who had used every year given to her and had not been careful about it in the diminishing sense of that word. On their 25th wedding anniversary in October 1907, Hugh gave her a gift that he presented at breakfast without ceremony, which was his preferred mode for things that mattered too much for ceremony. It was a book, a new volume of Whitman, the same poet whose inscription had told her something about their history before she understood what she was reading. Inside the front cover he had written in his careful, deliberate hand, "To R, who was the judge of that and who judged correctly, with love always." H. She read it and looked up at him across the table. The kitchen was full of morning light, the particular golden light of a Wyoming October that is one of the most beautiful things the world produces without announcement or fanfare. "I love you," she said, which was not something she said any less often for having said it thousands of times. "I know," he said. "I love you back." "Considerably. Considerably," she repeated. "That is a new qualifier." "I have been saving it for a significant occasion," he said, and the dry delivery was the same as it had always been, and still, after 25 years, made her want to laugh. She did laugh. She got up from her chair and came around the table and kissed him good morning in the golden light of their kitchen on the anniversary of the day she had married him. And outside the window the Wyoming plain rolled toward the mountains in the clear autumn air, and the horses moved in the pasture, and the double S was as much a part of the landscape now as the mountains themselves, having grown into the ground over 25 years of rain and sun, and the daily labor of people who believed in what they were building. Thomas and Margaret had their first child in 1906, a boy they named Daniel Hugh Slater, in a decision about the middle name that had been kept secret until the announcement, and the expression on Hugh's face when he understood what the name meant was one Rebecca kept in the private museum of her most treasured moments. Eleanor came home for Christmas of 1907, having nearly completed her medical training, and she was so clearly and completely herself, this daughter of theirs, This person who had known from the age of 10 what she wanted, and had gone to get it with a directness that her parents recognized without surprise, that the holiday had the quality of a homecoming in the largest sense. On the last night of Alina's visit, the four of them sat in the parlor after dinner, Thomas and Margaret and their baby on one side and Hugh and Rebecca on the other, and Alina in the chair by the fire that had always been the good reading chair, and the conversation moved through all the things that matter, the ranch and the world and the children and the future and the past. Rebecca looked at her husband across the room. He caught her looking and held her gaze, and what passed between them in that moment was everything that had been built across 25 years and all the years before them that had made them each who they needed to be to find each other, and all the years still ahead. The whole arc of it, from a gun pressed against a chest in the fading light to this fire-lit room full of the people they loved. She had been the judge of it. She had judged correctly. And the verdict had been, was, and would continue to be, worth it. All of it, every difficult and extraordinary inch. Hugh raised his coffee cup slightly in her direction, a small private toast. She raised hers in return. Outside, the Wyoming night was full of stars, enormous and absolute and indifferent in the way of great things, and the double S sat in it as it always had, a lamp in the dark, a place where people had chosen each other and kept choosing, and the mountains watched from their ancient patience, and the story that had begun with a gun and a second chance, and a woman who refused to let a man be the judge of his own worthiness continued, warmly and completely and without end.